So Doug Barrett is an artist and scholar working on experimental music, media studies, and contemporary art. His second monograph, Experimenting the Human, Art, Music, and the Contemporary Posthuman, appeared in 2023, University of Chicago Press. And his book, After Sound Toward a Critical Music, was published in 2016. He will be in discussion with Doug Geers, who is a composer who works extensively with technology and composition, performance, and multimedia collaborations. Doug is at Brooklyn College, where he's associate professor of music and director of the Center for Contemporary, for the Center for Computer Music, and director of the MFA program in Sonic Arts. He's also on the music faculty of the CUNY Graduate School. Okay, Doug, turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Helen. Thanks also to Doug Geers. I hope you all have come prepared with your multiple Doug jokes, light bulb screwing in and whatnot. Any and all are welcome. So hit us up once we get to that part. It's great to be here. Like Helen said, I work on the intersections between music, media, and technology. I teach at a place called Syracuse University. And today, my talk is titled Experimenting the Human. It comes from my book that was published last year on the University of Chicago Press. It argues that a kind of music known as experimental music speaks to the historical condition that we find ourselves in since the Second World War, which I call the contemporary post-human. So this condition takes on many forms, and we'll sort of explore kind of what I mean by it throughout the course of this talk. But I want to start with something of an illustration. So if the ambitions of one tech corporation come to fruition, listeners may soon be able to stream music directly to their brains. The tech entrepreneur Elon Musk recently confirmed that the ability to listen to music silently without headphones is a feature planned for the neural implant chip his company Neuralink is currently developing. More than an audio device, to be sure, the implant promises to function as a multi-purpose brain-machine interface that connects to your phone. With precedence in medical therapeutics and EEG, the chip physically replaces a small piece of skull and uses a neurosurgical robot to stitch fine electrode threads into the brain. So far, the device has been implanted in animals. So what I'll show you next is what Musk calls his 3 Little Pigs demo. And the name of the pig you'll see is Gertrude. Okay, this is a high energy pig. All right, Gertrude, thanks for coming out. So what the beeps you're hearing are real-time signals from the neural link in Gertrude's head. So this neural link connects to neurons that are in her snout. So whenever she snuffles around and touches something with her snout, that sends out neural spikes, which are detected here. Okay, so more recently, Neuralink announced the first human test subject. Nolan Arbo's partially successful implant has allowed him to play video games and browse the internet, even though some 85% of the device's electrodes have retracted from his brain. Music streaming remains aspirational, as is direct brain-to-brain communication. Musk's goal is to use the device to meet the supposed existential risk or existential threat of AI by allowing us to merge with it. What can Musk's vision tell us about the status of the human in a moment marked by its purported technological decentering? What role has music played, particularly experimental music since the Second World War, in developing and challenging the concept of the post-human? This concept ranges in function between fantasy, engineering program, and historical diagnosis. It refers to the human's relativization, even its potential supersession, amid technoscientific, biological, medical, and economic networks. As a node in such networks, the human is no longer the exclusive agent of change. Today, change seems as likely to arise from an environmental disaster or a global pandemic as it is from an economic system we're told is beyond anyone's control. In this talk, I want to show some of the ways post-war experimental music addresses this post-human condition, along with the period of time in which it emerges, known as the contemporary. So the contemporary is a concept that derives from art theory during the 1980s and 90s as an alternative to postmodernism. There's more to say about it, obviously, than I'll be able to get into today, but it refers to, we can say, the uneven temporality of post-war global capitalism. Time moves forward for some during this period, while it seems to stand still or even move backward for others. The contemporary post-human, then, my attempt to kind of bring these concepts together, is a function of this non-linear time. Some suggest we've already become technological post-humans. Meanwhile, others emphasize the extended consequences of people of color, women, LGBTQ people, workers, and other subaltern subjects having not been considered fully human in the first place. Like the contemporary, the post-human points forwards and backwards at the same time. Many think of Neuralink, along with apps that we heard of earlier, and I'm certain we heard of from yesterday about, like ChatGPT. Many think of these advents as kind of unprecedented breakthroughs, but as some of you, many of you, I'm sure know, much of this tech dates back to at least the 1940s. Propelled by the Second World War, the military science movement, and of course Helen talked briefly about this earlier, the military science movement known as cybernetics not only created the atom bomb, but also invented computers, neural networks, and subject of this symposium, artificial intelligence. I'll add in here, there's a significant strand that has to do with the notion of control, right? So cybernetics, as you can barely see, is very much preoccupied with this notion of control and communication, the subtitle of the mathematician Norbert Wiener's book titled Cybernetics. Moreover, such cybernetic discoveries beyond computers and artificial intelligence have significantly challenged what it means to be human. If machines can do our work and even think for us, what makes us human in the first place? It turns out we're still trying to figure that out. This is because the meaning of being human arguably hasn't changed since the 17th century. It was during this time that the philosopher René Descartes famously said, "I think, therefore I am." We are humans because we can think, a core tenet of the philosophical movement that arose around this time called humanism. From Descartes' simple conjecture, a slew of implications range from political economy to race to gender and sexuality. If we are brains that possess our bodies, some theorists figured, then we can simply lease those bodies out for waged labor. As John Locke wrote in 1690, quote, "Every man has a property in his own person," end of quote. Rather than being a body, the human, rendered on purpose here as man, possesses one. This philosophy set the stage for capitalism as we know it today. More recently, the scholar Alexander Wahilia has theorized further historical effects of the restriction of man in John Locke's formulation, and others, to what he calls the heteromasculine, white, propertied, and liberal subject, an ideology that rendered others as non-humans to be oppressed under colonialism and slavery. Given its apparent shortcomings, then, some wonder why we don't simply throw out humanism's vexed concept of the human. Still others, like Sylvia Wynter, see the only way out as through it, the human of humanism that is, may provide the very conditions of possibility for its overcoming. So altogether, then, the contemporary post-human stands for this complex historical condition of the human, pointing to a technological future while, in some sense, ideologically tethered to its past. So before showing some of the examples of how post-war experimental music speaks to the condition of the contemporary post-human, I want to touch on the work of the composer John Cage as a very important kind of predecessor of much of the work that I'm going to be discussing, and in particular his notion of indeterminacy. So unlike cybernetics, which sought more control, right? We recall from Norbert Wiener's book, indeterminacy was about giving it up, about relinquishing control. In this way, experimental music prefigures the post-human by attempting to remove the human from the creative process, as paradoxical as that sounds. Years before her landmark 1999 text, How We Became Post-Human, the literary theorist N. Catherine Hales spoke at one of John Cage's last public appearances in 1992. Hales, writing about this, focuses on Cage's notion of chance operations, divining the I Ching text, flipping coins, rolling dice, etc. Beyond these methods, Cage used computer algorithms to compose the ambitious 1969 multimedia work Harpsichord, one of the canonical early works of algorithmic music, or artificial intelligence music, we might call it today, a collaboration with the composer and scientist Lajaren Hiller. And during the 1980s, Cage created more than 26 computer applications, or apps, if you prefer to use that term, that could generate poetry and various forms of chance operations. Hales, in her writing, focuses on a tension between the open-ended aspects of chance and the implication of control inherent to operations, so chance operations. When framed in relation to contemporary science, Cage speaks to a paradoxical attempt, she says, quote, to grasp through our intentions a world that always exceeds and outruns those intentions, end of quote. Cagean indeterminacy confronts the post-human by homologizing its challenge to human agency. A tension arises then between indeterminacy's programmatic withdrawal of control and the cybernetic control that gives way to the post-human. In 1955, Cage defined experimentalism as the musical result of an act, the outcome of which is unknown. His statement contains a kind of scientism comparable to that of the European avant-garde at the time. And of course, many think of experimentalism as the main, if not sole, proprietor of indeterminacy. In fact, both sides of this rift, and some of you kind of more in the weeds music scholars will know what I mean when I say the sort of Darmstadt encounters. This is sort of famous music festival where the kind of North American and British strands of experimentalism come into contact with the European avant-garde movement there. But in fact, both of these sort of sides used similar techniques like graphic scores, so using kind of illustrations and different kind of non-traditional musical annotations to prompt musical sound and performance, various kinds of open forms, statistical structures. But nevertheless, Cage really insisted on distinguishing what he was doing from these European colleagues. He insisted that, for instance, the German composer Karl-Heinz Stockhausen and his Klavierstück 11, what's 11 in German? I can't think of it right now, but it's from 1956, was not an example of indeterminacy. Whereas this score could be played in all these sorts of different orders and the performer had certain control over things, Cage said, well, all it really allows is this kind of large scale variability. It doesn't have enough of this kind of unpredictable character at the kind of micro level. So there's not enough that's kind of unknown about the musical results. Remember, for Cage, it's the outcome, the musical result of an outcome of which is unknown. Cage, of course, is not the only proponent of experimentalism strategies of non-control. James Tenney, while composing his 1964 algorithmic computer music dedicated to Cage, suggests that his, quote, last vestiges of external shaping had disappeared, end of quote. No longer beholden to the sole will of the human, Tenney cedes agency to the algorithm. In addition to indeterminacy, I argue that experimental music produces extra artistic meaning through its interdisciplinary involvements with science and technology. This music not only uses tech like neural networks and artificial intelligence, but it also intervenes in centuries-old questions about what humans are in the first place. So for instance, now to get to some of the actual musical examples that I discuss in the book, in 1965, Alvin Lucier composed Music for Solo Performer, a work that calls for electrodes to be attached to the scalp of a musician who sits motionless as their brain waves activate percussion instruments. So here's a short clip of that work. And apologies for the glitchiness again. Okay, yeah. So I think you kind of get a rough idea there, but Lucier is sitting in a chair. He has, like I said, electrodes connected to his scalp. And the way he describes it is that he's not doing a whole lot of processing of these brainwaves. He merely amplifies them. So they're being emitted at between 8 and 12 cycles per second. And any acoustics experts in the audience will know that that's below the threshold of human hearing, which is around 20 cycles per second. But he still just connected that signal to loudspeakers that would still move at that rate, right? So we thought, well, what is that if not an audio signal? Well, it's a rhythm. So he just simply put the speakers on top of these percussion instruments and got this kind of rattly kind of percussion music. And another aspect is that he has to kind of obtain this particular kind of cognitive state in order to produce those vibrations that apparently you enter it when you refrain from visualizing. It's a little complicated, but so the idea then is that once the sound starts to build up, it tends to break that state of concentration. So hence kind of feedback network. So this work is very much involved in sort of ideas from cybernetics, not only the kind of technology of EEG. But to kind of connect it to where we began, sort of a year after he premiered Music for Solo Performer, I think he anticipates something like Neuralink when he writes, quote, I would love to be able to hook my brain up with the audience's brains so that I can tell them how I hear and think without having to move through the air, end of quote. So beyond these kind of percussion sounds, Lucier in other writings about this work alludes to something like cognitive labor, and sort of during the 60s, of course, theories about mental work were starting to emerge, and even sort of like in political economy, when he refers to these speakers themselves as doing work. So they're kind of laboring in a sense. Totally different example, and jumping ahead several decades here, the composer Pamela Z uses a device called the body synth to perform an opera about the voice. I have an excerpt here.
Announcer voice, anxious voice, Asian voice, authoritative voice, fashion voice, outstanding voice, elegant vicious voice.
Okay, so not only does Pamela Z use these audio communications technologies, but she also considers their cultural meanings. In a scene called Voice Studies, for instance, she addresses the problem of linguistic profiling in housing discrimination. So basically callers being denied apartments based on the sound of their voice.
Studies have revealed that people can often infer the race of an individual based on the sound of their voice. John Bow, a linguistics professor at Stanford University, did a study on housing discrimination based on vocal profiling. This is the voice of Professor Bow.
Okay, so you can find this online and listen to more if you'd like, but Pamela Z, very amazing composer. This is another artist and composer I write about, Letitia Sanami. This is an instrument that she made in 1991. She calls it the Lady's Glove. It's a wearable electronic instrument that she kind of thought of as a certain type of response to the military aesthetics often involved in similar instruments created during the 1980s. She refers to this instrument, which began as a modified pair of kitchen garments, as she calls it, the perfect housewife's tool. Obviously, a little jokingly there, but I find even further complicated by whether the perfect modifies housewife or housewife's tool. In any case, I have a performance of a more recent version of this instrument here. And the last example is Namjoon Paik's walking, talking robot K456, which he created in 1964. Speaking about his robot, he says, quote, "Generally, people say that robots are created to decrease people's work, but my robot is there to increase the work for people because we need 5 people to make it move for 10 minutes. End of quote. So what to make of this robot? I interpret it as a kind of comment on the limits of automation and human labor. So Pike's robot performed experimental music in various concerts over the years. Yet on multiple occasions, it kind of broke down. It just simply didn't work. He described it at the last, he would say that it had stage fright. So you could say also that it's kind of participating in this refusal to perform, or maybe even a kind of refusal to work, you know, sort of like what was it going on strike? And Another question might be later on, so this is from a performance during the 1980s, he had it kind of collide with a car. So was it attempting suicide, right? So I think this speaks to a certain kind of paradox that various cybernetics theorists explored, which is sort of the idea of a robot or of an automated system refusing to work. And through that sort of, to me, well, the idea of striking or quitting or even just labor organizing more broadly seems to have some very distinct and unique kind of human dimension to it that makes its application to robots and automation all the more strange and kind of uncanny. So to conclude then, and this is a bit of footage from the robot K456, I contend that post-war experimental music both composes and reflects on the contemporary post-human and the work, in addition to the work of Pamela Z, Lucier, Sanami, and Pike. I consider in the book musicians who use artificial intelligence, robotics, biofeedback, and even radio astronomy. What these experiments have in common is an engagement with the notion that the privileged position of the human is increasingly being challenged by cultural, biological, medical, economic, and technoscientific means. Yet rather than the postmodern, the temporality proper to this post-human subject, I argue, is the contemporary, and the art form that most rigorously and imaginatively responds to it is experimental music. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Doug Geers. I'm a composer. I work with technology a lot in my work. And so you can call me Doug #2 this morning. I'm the one with the glasses and the beard, so you can obviously tell me apart from Doug #1. But I was listening to your talk, and there's a lot of really interesting work that you're referencing there. And I assume that many of the people in the audience are not composers, all of that work. But as you said to me before your talk, it's kind of canonical for a lot of us. And it's really interesting to see them sort of align together. And I was reflecting on them and thinking about, well, what do they have in common? And sort of what are things that were motivating these composers when they were doing these works? And I was thinking that the extension of the artist is maybe part of it, to sort of have a meta persona by having this technological assistance. Possibly the sort of hyper instrument idea, to take the idea of what is a musical instrument and extend it. Did Namjoon Paik's robot play recordings? Is that right?
Yeah, it had the speaker, as you can see,
Yeah.
as kind of a head, and I believe so. It played back recording with JFK,
Mm-hmm.
and I forget who it was at the time, but the mayor of New York City, who I'm just blanking on. But so it would do that in these kind of like outdoor street guerrilla performances, and he would just sort of take it around. There was one appearance at Washington Square. And another thing that's really fascinating about it, which I don't have time to go into, is that so he would sort of present it as though it was talking, and then it would also shit. So it would he had these beans that he would just sort of drop as though it was
Like a rabbit or something. Yeah.
Street.
Yeah.
And something that I think is so sort of sophisticated, and obviously it's sort of this combination of his wittiness, but also just kind of incredible historical and intellectual engagement, that this shitting robot sort of characteristic alludes back to these 18th century robots that were doing very similar things. So this 18th century French inventor named Vaucanson famously made a duck that pooped. So that's sort of something where I'm sort of interpreting what he's doing as this like series of very intricate homages. And of course, you know, so like you're combining the present and these JFK speeches, but also sort of, you know, thinking back, more than 100 years, 200 years for that matter. So yeah, I guess there's other things that you would say too about sort of the extension of the artist and so forth. But I guess did it feel that way for you? The robot as being this kind of almost like, I guess you mentioned hyper instrument.
Right. I think it's just interesting to think about because also Pike did other works with music, famously the cello, for instance, and so he was definitely music was important to his concept of his art, and so I was just thinking of the robot as a kind of musical instrument or musical avatar for him that he could kind of send out into the world, and obviously now in online social media apps, et cetera, you know, often we are designing our avatars or we are able to choose an avatar. And there's this cute thing that maybe many of you are familiar with that Google devised about 4 or 5 years ago called the Blob Opera. I don't know if you've seen this, but it's like 4 blobby creatures on a sort of virtual stage, and you grab them with your cursor and stretch them and they sing, and you can like play with them and make them create music on the fly. It's a kind of musical instrument with AI technology. And so I see some relationship there between having these avatars, having this physical robot in the world, and Pike as kind of someone who was pre what we would now call AI, but sort of leaning into these concepts in a really interesting way. One other thing, and you mentioned John Cage at the beginning, and I think he's such an interesting figure relating to all of this, especially because he's often known as the one who was about giving up control and using chance. But then you mentioned all of these computer programs that he wrote or were written with him or for him. And I think there's an interesting tension between the idea of the process and procedure, which is an algorithm, you know, which could be encoded, that Cage was up to, versus his sort of philosophical approach, which was about giving up control. And how strongly do you feel the other artists that you mentioned relate, especially I was thinking of Pike and Lucier, but anybody in terms of his work and his ideas?
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly a lineage there that's quite strong, right? And to me, that's the real, I mean, you nailed it, right? Like the linking sort of concept or approach or kind of common artistic sensibility is that embrace of indeterminacy, right? So what makes experimental music experimental? Well, if you ask Cage, and I think this sort of loose grouping of composers and artists, it's the notion of kind of giving up control, which of course is paradoxical, right? What does it mean to will the lack of will, right? It's sort of this, and I think that's part of what makes it an artistic practice, is that it deals in paradox, right? I think and I guess one thing that might be embedded in that question is maybe like the relationship between Cage and the other artists that I talk about. And I guess what I kind of didn't have time to go into is that I think Cage really importantly kind of telegraphs something, or kind of puts down the kind of conditions of possibility for something that he doesn't quite take up in the same ways that his kind of artistic descendants ended up doing. And that is really this kind of in more of an embrace on the more of an embrace of the kind of extra artistic content, if you will, of that process and of the work. So he does these, like, for example, everyone knows the famous silent composition, 4 minutes and 33 seconds, right? So you may think about that, and perhaps rightly so, as a kind of like high modernist artwork, musical work par excellence, right? It's the lack of signification and meaning, right? But I actually think I'm very much compelled by a small group of queer theorists, art historians, and musicologists who insist, no, this was a really pointed kind of political statement during the 1950s, one of the most violently homophobic eras in history, right? And this was his way of kind of protesting by removing sort of a clear, determined statement from the work, because if you were adamantly protesting in the streets, you might be met by an even more severe form of violence, right? Nevertheless, I don't think that Cage sort of fully takes up that sort of approach, right? And the term that I use from art history and criticism is post-formalist, right? So you're sort of beginning with the forms of art and music, but producing work that speaks beyond it. And I think that Lucier, Letitia Sanami, Namjoon Pike, and the others, Pamela Z, I analyze, allow a little bit more for that. So it's not to say that they've sort of given up on the musical artistic forms, but there's sort of more room for it. So that's kind of again a bit of stuff that I didn't go into in as much detail.
Yeah, and I think that your choice of musicians in your book is an interesting array, because they, at first glance, seem pretty different in a lot of ways. I mean, what Pamela Z does and what Alvin Lucier did, for instance, sort of on the surface and sort of philosophically are not adjacent, I think, but that makes me look for the underlying similarities, or at least relationships among them, which I think is really interesting. And just, I'm not sure we have an answer to this, but it's interesting to sort of posit in the context of today's presentation, how do these artists point to what's now happening with AI, and what can that tell us about how we might relate to AI as a creative tool to engage with? Are there examples? Are there warnings? Are there conceptual frameworks that we might use? And this is sort of unrelated, but I just was thinking about this during your talk, so I'm just going to drop it in. In the early mid 1950s, there was a couple, Louis and Bebe Barron, who lived in New York City and had one of the first tape recorders in the United States. And they worked with John Cage and some other experimental composers. And they did the soundtrack to this very bad science fiction movie named Forbidden Planet. And for Forbidden Planet, they built circuits. They were following the concepts of cybernetics, and they built circuits that were sort of purposely dysfunctional and then amplified what the circuits did, and got these musical materials that sort of came to life as the circuits sort of burned up, and then spliced this together into a soundtrack. And when they talked about it, they sort of talked about these circuits as like little beings, like little entities that had lives and voices that were just very brief. And I think of that as another sort of prototypical, it's tying in with the cybernetics, and also the idea of having a artistic partner that is artificial, and that this partner does something that is kind of a black box, because they didn't totally understand electronics and what they were building, or purposely were sort of hacking electronics beyond their understanding to find sounds that they may not imagine and compose. And when I think about using algorithms to compose and technology to compose, I think that's part of the fun, is that there is this chance that something unexpected is going to happen. But is that why we would use AI to create, or is there something else? Or I just thought I'd throw all of this at you and see what you have to say.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. I mean, I think definitely that's something this work really truly embraces, right? Like the sort of broken aspect, the kind of the unpredictability of, whether it's devices or computer apps, AI programs or what have you, that it's about sort of taking these things on their own terms, and almost like the beauty of the malfunctioning, the kind of the chaotic dimension of something not quite doing what you thought it was going to do.
Mhm.
Everyone sort of talks about like the hallucinations that AI is doing, and that like how can we get rid of the hallucinations? And maybe the hallucinations are there's something there. Maybe that's something to focus on and to bring out. Well, maybe it'll be lamentable when the hallucinations are gone.
Mhm, mhm.
But one of the artists I didn't talk about today, Yasin Al-Tone, is well, actually one of the few artists who actually uses AI, but he does it in a way that I think is totally along the lines of what you suggest. And he worked with these British computer scientists to essentially make a program that simulates his previous performances, which is very strange because he's known as this, makes these, well, it started off kind of doing a lot of fluxus, intermedia and performance. But a lot of what he's done over the decades, it's like this super harsh, dense noise, right? Like, how do you simulate that performance, right? So anyway, but they ended up making this system that sort of approximated what he does when he sits and performs on his laptop, which is like turn a knob or two here, listen for a clap. So he has this application that he can just sort of instantiate a few different versions of himself. It sort of like gets also to that avatar idea that you're talking about. But what's sort of interesting to me is that it ends up sort of malfunctioning in a certain way. It doesn't quite, and even the kind of engineering process. So they started out seeking to build this kind of neural network system that was, you might say, has more in common with today's AI than the AI of 10 or 20 years ago. And then at a certain point, the engineers, it turns out, because all the press releases don't say this, they say it uses neural network.
Yeah.
But I interviewed the engineers and they said, actually, that's not how it works. They just ended up using what's known as an expert system, essentially a bunch of rules that say, when this happens, do this, as opposed to this kind of learning over time and through kind of training data that, ChatGPT, as we know, does. But I just found this interesting how the system itself doesn't behave in the ways that it's purported to work. Yasin Al-Tone himself prefers this kind of deviation from what the original plan seems to have been. In fact, the work is called AI deviation.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, I just really like that. I think he's kind of this figure for me who is certainly, like, he was friends with Cage, very much directly taking from him, but I also think sort of moves it in a somewhat of a different direction. Even has some sort of different terminologies that like relate to indeterminacy. They're sort of getting in like a set of different emphases.
So we're going to move on to the next, and I'm sure people are going to have a lot of questions. So we want to get the next presentation up. So the next speakers will be focusing more on visual. As I said, for the live stream audience, in which I didn't speak into the mic, that was about sound history, in a way, sound music. And the next speaker is Andreas Killen, and he specializes in cultural and intellectual history of modern Europe. Andreas is a recipient of fellowships at UCLA Humanities Consortium and the Max Planck Institute. for History of Science in Germany. His most recent book is Nervous Systems, Brain Science in the Early Cold War, HarperCollins 2023. It's on the psychiatry and the invention of nervousness as a medical and cultural response to the modernizing process.
Actually, a different book, Helen.
Oh, okay. Well, you can correct me. You can give the right book. I'm reading from the program. So that's Andreas, and he'll be followed by London's Tsai, who is a mathematically trained visual artist in Brooklyn. And London's work is in the permanent collection of the Butler Institute of American Art, the Institute of Health Metrics and Evaluation, University of Washington, Seattle Art Museum, Bartles Foundation, many, many more. You can read it in the program. So they'll be giving talks and kind of in dialogue with each other. And as I said from yesterday's symposium, a lot of concepts are coming up now about cybernetics. And as Doug mentioned, also about hallucination.
Yes, I'm very happy that you mentioned hallucination.
He's
'cause
prompted
I'm gonna be
Andres' talk.
returning to that topic. Yes, hello, everyone. Thanks for coming out this morning. And thank you to Helen for the very kind invitation to present here. So my very brief talk today will be in part drawn from the books she mentioned, which is about brain science in the 1950s, and in part based on my conversations with London Tsai, the sculptor, and my friend, the sculptor, London Tsai. So when we look back at the origins of artificial intelligence in the early post-World War II era, we encounter a world of strange and now mostly forgotten contrivances whose design reflected the efforts of scientists to emulate and in some cases enhance and even go beyond human thought and perception. These included electronic brains or computers, of course, but also a panoply of other inventions, homeostats, mechanical tortoises. I'll show you an image of those, dream machines, which London will talk about, cybernetic forms of sculpture and art, and so forth. And many of these efforts to create so-called machines with intelligence originated in scientific laboratories, but then escaped those spaces and entered into the world of science fiction, philosophical thought experiment, and avant-garde art, such as the forms that Douglas and Doug were we're just talking about. So I'm going to offer you a few examples of this drawn from my own work. At the very beginning of the 1950s, the Anglo-American neurophysiologist and cybernetician Gray Walter introduced the world to his mechanical tortoises. These simple creations, Elsie and Elmer, were equipped with light and motion sensors and also had the capacity to record experience. Walter demonstrated that they could not only learn from their experiences, but that also in response to conflicting incentives or sources of information, they could be driven mad or neurotic. Rather provocatively, he also claimed that they exhibited free will. They were shown, as you can see here in the caption, they were shown at something called the Science Exhibition, which was held in London in 1951. This was to commemorate the Crystal Palace exhibit of 1851. And they attracted a great deal of attention when displayed there. Alan Turing, who had just published his landmark piece, Computing Machinery and Intelligence in 1950, was one of many who were fascinated by the so-called mirror dance that these creatures performed as they reacted to the sight of their own reflections in a mirrored surface. Another figure who was also deeply fascinated by these creatures was Jacques Lacan. Anyways, Turing seems to have regarded them as examples of the new possibilities for connecting human and machine intelligence that had emerged during this period. And according to one recent account of the history of cybernetics, Walter's robots now provide the template for work being done at MIT's AI laboratory. Okay, I have some other images. So, in addition to being a robotics pioneer, Gray Walter was a clinician who treated patients with epilepsy. And in his clinical work, Walter made pioneering use of electroencephalography, or EEG, to study brainwave patterns. So I think this is what Lucier was hooked up to, right? He also, you can't quite see it here, but in the background, you'll notice that the patient on the reclining couch or bed has a lamp suspended over their head. That is a stroboscopic lamp. And what Walter discovered in his research was that he could use strobe to help induce and then study seizure-like phenomena in his patients in the controlled circumstances of his clinic. It became, it was a valuable, part of the research to actually artificially induce something like a seizure in his patients and then study, the phenomena associated with that. Walter further demonstrated that he could produce such experiences in a certain number of non-epileptic subjects. In essence, what he was doing was experimentally producing epilepsy or epileptic phenomena in the controlled circumstances of his clinic. And what especially fascinated him in these studies or in these experiences, as he wrote in his book, The Living Brain, was the capacity of strobe, or as he called it, of flicker, to elicit hallucinations. The kind of hallucinations sometimes experienced in connection with the onset of epilepsy. From his observations of this phenomenon, he drew a number of conclusions about the properties of the nervous system and of the brain. And some of these conclusions excited a great deal of interest and speculation on the part of his many readers, many of whom were non-specialists. In fact, Walter's book, which was first published in 1953 and then reissued in 1963, Walter's book and its account not simply of the tortoises, but also of these experimentally produced hallucinations, was widely read, and it exercised a considerable influence over large parts of the 60s avant-garde. Perhaps most notably, they became the basis for something called the dream machine. This was a contraption, a device invented at the very beginning of the 1960s by Brian Geisen, Ian Somerville, and William S. Burroughs. The dream machine consists of a lamp housed inside a perforated cylinder, a conical cylinder with holes pierced through the surface, mounted on a turntable. And so when the turntable is activated and the device begins to rotate, it emits rhythmic flashes that can be synchronized with the brain's alpha waves, which operate in the 8 to 13 hertz per second range. And that this phenomenon produced vivid hallucinations in the viewer. The dream machine was described by Brian Geisen as the first work of art meant to be looked at with eyes closed. And it was celebrated by him and by the other members of this group as a device that opened up dramatic new worlds of visionary experience. It's in this context that I want to locate the form of cybernetic art known as cybernetics. Among the most interesting of the machines with intelligence that began to appear in the middle of the 20th century are the works of the sculptor Wen-Ying Tsai and later on his son London Tsai. The immediate source of inspiration for this work came to Wen-Ying Tsai one day. He had trained as an engineer, but in the early 60s had left that profession and sort of reinvented himself as an artist. And he was spending a month or so at an artist colony up in northern New Hampshire. And one day as he was sitting on the porch of the cabin that he was staying in, his attention became drawn to the flickering light effects produced by sunlight shining through the leaves of the trees around this cabin. And these light effects reminded him of the strobe lamps that he'd earlier encountered in his work as an engineer. He subsequently dedicated himself to finding ways of using strobe to create what he called natural movements in dynamic equilibrium with intelligence. Starting in the mid-1960s and continuing up until today, the works made by father and son Tsai typically feature ensembles made up of three main elements. Here you see one such work of art or one such sculpture. So stainless steel rods, very slender stainless steel rods mounted on a rotating base. Noise-activated feedback systems and a stroboscopic lamp. So the feedback systems allow these ensembles to incorporate viewer reaction. So clapping, singing, shouting, making noise of various kinds into the performance of the piece. In response to the noise made by the visitor, the gently oscillating movement of the rods in their normal state, because they're mounted on a rotating base, this gentle oscillation changes in the eyes of the viewer, becoming increasingly agitated or frenzied in response to noise-activated alterations in the frequency of the stroboscopic flashes. I hope I've made that clear. So nothing changes in the ensemble itself, apart from the changes, the noise-activated changes in the frequency of the strobe, right? And that induces this, I guess, perceptual illusion that the movement of the rods has changed in quite dramatic ways. Once the noise stops, once the viewer ceases their singing or whatever, the strobe light returns to its original frequency, the rods to their original state of gentle undulation, or one might also refer here to homeostasis. While the original intent of these works was to create sort of trance-like altered states of perception, in their most recent form, London Tsai's version of the dream machine, they generate vivid hallucinations. I'm going to let London speak about that, but I would like to show a brief clip. If anybody is light sensitive, I suggest they cover their eyes. Can I do this? Yeah. So yeah, you sit in front of this with your eyes closed, and yeah, it's really quite remarkable what happens inside your head. So before wrapping up, I just want to return to the point that Douglas made, the interesting fact that hallucination is now part of the terminology of modern AI. As everybody knows, many AI products are highly buggy. And the term hallucination has been adopted in reference to the possibility of error that AI products generate. Hallucination is seen as a bug to be eliminated in pursuit of a kind of AI enhanced future. Chat GPT products now routinely advertise themselves as hallucination free. But for the mid 20th century scientists and artists and others that I spoke of earlier, hallucination was not so much of a bug, but really kind of a feature, and an intensely meaningful one at that. And so I think, to end with the question is really, what, if anything, can today's manufacturers and prophets of AI learn from their predecessors in relationship to this, to the story and to the phenomenon that is now so bedeviling the field of modern and artificial intelligence. Okay, thank you. I'm going to turn things over now.
Well, good morning. It's great to be here. I'd also like to thank Helen Ko for this opportunity to present with my friend Andreas Killen, which has actually led to some new realizations, one of which I will share at the end of my very brief talk. So let's see. I'd like to talk about cybernetics and give you a short transgenerational introduction, beginning with my father. So my father, Tsai, was a pioneer cybernetic sculptor and inventor of cybernetics. He studied mechanical engineering at the University of Michigan, and upon graduation, immediately set out for New York City. I don't think he even attended the ceremonies, where he found work as a consulting engineer, while also pursuing his true calling at the Art Students League. So eventually he created abstract paintings like these, which won him a John Hay Whitney Fellowship for Painting. He decided to accept the award and quit his engineering job because those were the terms of this grant. And so after that, he had a crisis. He suddenly could not paint. And so he was racking his brains as to what he should do, and he decided to go travel in Europe. And I think during his travels, he came to some realization that he ought to use his engineering background to make art. And so after that, he started making these construction paintings. And the construction paintings are made with day-glow pigments. He was probably one of the first, if not the first, to use these pigments. And they were actually rarely shown with the black light that he intended. So for example, William Seitz included him in The Responsive Eye in 1965, but from the documentary, you can see that there's no black light. It was in a completely brightly lit room. He was able to get into that show because he had two solo shows at the Amo Gallery in 1964 and 65. And I think these works show that he was very interested in optical effects. And here you have the psychologist Rudolf Arnheim actually giving a talk about, I guess, optical phenomena in front of this painting of my father's called Random Field. And this is actually in a documentary that you can find on YouTube by a very young Brian De Palma. So very different from what he did subsequently. So not satisfied with these static sculptures, static constructions, that was one of the requirements of William Seitz's exhibition, The Responsive Eye, that nothing should move. And so moving beyond that, he incorporated motors and created these kind of psychedelic multi-kinetic pieces. And they're also meant to be lit with UV lighting. And so it was during his stay at the Edward McDowell colony in New Hampshire that my father had a career-defining experience. So just being in nature, whether it was on the porch of his cottage or being in the woods of New Hampshire, here's a picture of how it looks like today. You can see that the trees are very close together. So I imagine that he might have been walking in these woods and experienced the flicker of the sun through these branches and trunks of trees. And this sudden experience reminded him of the stroboscope that he used in engineering labs at the University of Michigan. And as we know, cybernetics was very much in the air since Norbert Wiener's book was published in 1948. I think, Douglas, you used this picture as well. And so those two books are in my dad's library. The bottom one is Ross Ashby's Introduction to Cybernetics. And what happened was that when he had this kind of epiphany, he immediately left McDowell Colony. He didn't stay for I guess it was 2-3 months that he had requested, and he just abruptly left. And he had to go to New York City, to Canal Street, to find the components that he needed to begin making these pieces. And my dad, it just blows me away how quickly he worked. So by 1967, he had already created a set of these new cybernetic works that he was able to show to Howard Wise, whose gallery was basically an epicenter of technological art. Namjoon showed there, Haka showed there, Otto Pina showed there. And Howard Wise said, well, let me put you into the Christmas group show. And my dad was very adamant that he wanted to have a one-man show, that this was not something that could just be put in to kind of a holiday kind of a event. So that's when he had a solo show in early '68, probably February. And this show led to many things in the same year. First, it led to cybernetic serendipity. I believe it was Namjoon who introduced Yasha Reichardt to my father, and she was trying to find artists for this exhibition in London in the summer of that year. So my dad was recruited, and then later that year, he was also in Pontus Huten's exhibition called The Machine as Seen at the End of the Mechanical Age. And because of this Howard Wise show, Otto Pina saw it, was at the opening, and he told Juri Kepish, who had created the Center for Advanced Visual Studies at MIT, he told him he has to come see it. So Kepish actually got on a plane the next day, flew down, saw that Wise show called Cybernetic Sculptures, and invited my father to be part of the first group of fellows at CAVS. And on the right, you have a picture of my dad as featured in Time magazine in an article by Robert Hughes for his show at the Denise René Gallery in New York. Okay, so now we can fast forward 20 years to me. So I studied math instead of engineering, even though I was accepted to the University of Michigan for engineering. I decided I didn't want to do that. So, but in the spirit of my father, I studied math, even, you know, with the plan to eventually incorporate it into my art. The problem is that math is so captivating that I sort of lost myself for about 6 years in that area, and then I eventually recovered and came back to art. So in about 2008, I began making sculpture. It took me a very long time to get to sculpture because of my father's influence, and I kind of wanted to stay away from his domain. And it was only that after many years of making these kind of two-dimensional mathematical drawings and paintings of higher dimensional things, that I realized that at least I should go into 3 dimensions because I could, you know, express these things better. So here you can see my studio in Brooklyn. You can see also the kind of things I made after that. But I was still staying away from kinetic pieces because I was anxious about, you know, entering my father's domain. So one object that fascinated me for decades and continues to fascinate me is the Hopf vibration. And I guess you can find out what that is on Wikipedia. Here's the largest version of it that I made. And it was incredibly difficult to make. It's taller than I am, so it's about 7 feet in diameter. And it has all these circular arcs and things like that. So after I made that, I was looking at it one day in my studio, and I thought, well, you know, if I could just spin something around and I could use my father's strobe light, and then I would suddenly get all these arcs for free. So here you can see my first experiment on the left there is a Hopf vibration generated using a stroboscope. And I converted my studio into a kinetic sculpture studio. You can see some examples of the experiments I was doing. You can even see on the bottom left there my cybernetic Duchamp, which yeah, it interacts with you as you approach it, and you can dance. It'll dance with you, actually. But that's a departure from my father's from cybernetics that actually moves. So these are other examples of my Hopf vibrations and my various. The one on the right is actually a hyperboloid of one sheet. It's got like fibers connecting the various rulers on it. And this picture is to show you how the different states of these rotary sculptures. So you can see I actually reversed the strobing from my father's. In my father's, the strobing increases when you interact with it. But here, the strobing actually slows down. So it goes from a very high speed to a low speed. And my father cannot do this because he had a xenon strobe. But today I'm actually using LED strobes. I actually have to make them. But the LED can actually be a constant light, and then it can be brought down with pulse width modulation to kind of a very strobing type effect. So these are different states depending on how you interact with it. So I had the fortune to meet Andreas at a party given by Richard Castellanets. And this is a couple years ago. And Andreas told me about the work of Gray Walter and his use of strobing in on epileptic patients, and his discovery that the frequency, the alpha frequency of the brain is between 8 and 13 hertz. Oh, yes. Okay, sure, yes. Okay, so reading, so yeah. So Gray Walter's popular book, The Living Brain, was revolutionary. William Burroughs, Brian Gysin, and Ian Somerville had all read it around the time they were at the Beat Hotel in Paris. And they found inspiration to make The Dream Machine. So reading these books and Andreas's new book, Nervous Systems, inspired me to explore flicker in a new way. The Edgerton strobe, which I had grown up with, became a new portal to worlds I had never experienced before. This led to my making of my first Dream Machine work, Rotary Hopf, which was a centerpiece in Cybernetics, our transgenerational exhibition in Gdansk last year. And Andreas wrote a beautiful essay for the book entitled Under the Spell of Cybernetics. And after the exhibition, I decided to reconstruct the Gysin-Somerville Dream Machine so that we could experience what the residents of the Beat Hotel did. And it was also an attempt for me to rediscover my father's experience in New Hampshire and Brian Gysin's in the south of France in 1958. So now that I have the privilege to use both Gysin's and Walter's Dream Machines, I actually sometimes use them in tandem. I don't think that has ever been done before. There are no words to describe this experience, which is why I brought my Gysin machine here today. So in conclusion, I want to share with you an idea that occurred to me recently because of this talk, and that's that the strobing phenomenon that is the cybernetic feature of cybernetics and the flicker of the dream machines cannot be captured in words or photographs or film or video. Because these are made for our particular visual apparatus and the frequency of our brain's alpha waves, they can only be experienced by humans. They are a sort of CAPTCHA. Computers and AI would not be able to see the cybernetics in cybernetics, nor would they sense the hallucinations induced by the dream machines. Thank you.
I'm just going to ask one question, then we'll open it up. I'm sure people have a lot of questions. So this is just a question for Doug Barrett because he talks about Namjoon Paik. And so you talked about Cage and Peck, these works being, and this is from today's frame, being apolitical. And I can see why that is the case. But in the case of Namjoon Paik, even though the robot was designed to, entertain, he actually was quite a politically minded, but very different from the 60s activists, street protests. And so the robot also, the whole audio component, which you didn't talk about, is political. And so really that political frame is a threat of nuclear annihilation, all of those things. So I found your talk interesting, and you talked about labor and the robot disrupting this idea of labor. And in the larger frame, Namjoon's work tended to focus on, disruption, mistakes, and glitches. And it seems to me that many of these artists, the way that they can appropriate these tools is by focusing on the mistakes. So not the way that it's intended, but actually the way that they are going to distort or change or malfunction it to work. So do you have any thoughts about, AI? And we had some AI artists yesterday, and it's so much faster, the speed and the corpus is so much larger. But did you have any thoughts about that, if it's possible today with AI?
Yeah, no, it's such a great question. There's so many facets to that. I'm reminded of so Pike wrote letters to Cage and several others, Charlotte Norman, In one of them, he said something like, in a different life, I can imagine being an economist on the level of Keynes or Marx. So it's sort of, he doesn't ever quite sort of pin down exactly a kind of hardcore ideological worldview per se. And in these instances, I feel like he's sort of, you might say strategically kind of ambiguous. Nevertheless, I agree that there's certainly a form of politics going on there in the work. And the whole chapter in the book, my interpretation of the robot, is all about, as you said, this sort of relationship between robotics and labor. And, certainly at the time, I think there was this real kind of important kind of fascination with what robotics and automation were doing to society. There's another moment where he says something like, robots will be roaming the streets and we have to change society in order to deal with that, right? And, we don't necessarily see robots roaming the streets today, but there is a, clear kind of burgeoning development of these, self-driving cars that I'm like, great, and we've seen it in New York that they come. Supposedly they're happening in San Francisco at the moment. I say this not entirely as a tangent because many of the sort of elements of Ike's robot were derived from the auto industry, had that whole kind of collision performance that I mentioned with a car. And there's a lot of this really interesting sort of historical development between the auto industry, how this, for example, this robotic arm was developed, was one of the first kind of programmable robots to be used in industry. So I definitely, like lots of threads here, but this is just to say that I think Ike was very political, and at the very least, sort of we'll all agree that there are some incredibly charged kind of cultural elements that of course deal with technology. He had a lot of also very provocative things regarding sexuality and erotics as well, which the robot itself had these rotating breasts, for example, whole other thread we can talk about.
Actually, it originally also had a penis, which was
That's true.
removed because people complained. So it was a hermaphrodite robot. But I was wondering, London, if you had anything to say about the way you're working with cybernetics, the technology. When you think about a technology that's already there, perhaps, and your alterations and modifications, or following it and adding other elements.
Yeah, for me, it's like I inherited cybernetics, and I'm trying to extend it in various ways, like just kind of playing with the parameters of it. I feel like I really, with the meeting with Andreas, I feel that I have found a kind of vein to explore, and this idea of it's just such a simple thing. It's just a shift in the range of frequency from a higher frequency that my father used to just kind of a lower frequency, just not by very much, but maybe a few hertz. And suddenly I'm in this realm where it's so different from what my father introduced to us. When you experience the hallucinations that arise from being in this frequency, it's quite spectacular. And I'm sort of kind of really trying to focus on that right now. And I feel that it allows me to kind of go around the AI and really focus on what it is that makes us human.
I'm going to open it up now to questions. I'm sure there are many. We do have a live stream, so if you have a question, speak into the mic.
Hi, I have a question for London. So you explained pretty clearly in your talk about how you went from mathematical art and how that led you to sculpture and then to kinematic sculpture, like with the hop vibration and everything. And I was just wondering if there was something mathematical in your understanding of the dream machine, or whether it's just once you got to strobes, that's a really cool thing with strobes also.
Right. So I grew up with these strobes. So they're my first experience of light, probably. You know, it's like the interesting thing is that with the dream machine, the strobing or the flicker actually gives me like mathematical visions. So I actually can see the hop vibration in it. You know, as it's spinning. What you really, I think the dream machine brings out what's inside of you. So you also have to let go. So this idea of trying to control what you see and what you think, you have to let that go. So in a way, it's similar to, you know, what Doug was talking about with John Cage and his group. You really have to let go, and then these visions come, and they are like somehow connected with you and who you are. And the mathematics that I have kind of incorporated through my years of study, they just come out, and I can see like I mean, it's a rotating cylinder, but I can see like nested cylinders, and I can see them turning into tori, and it's really, and I think every one of you who is able to will see something different. I mean, there are certain similarities in the experience, but I think you will bring to it your own person, and that's what makes it so exciting and interesting.
This is kind of a pedantic question, but could you give us advice if we go to encounter this device? How should we interact with it? How long should we expect to be with it? Because it sounds like we should all give this a try.
Yes, absolutely. If you don't have any photosensitivity or tendency towards seizures, you should probably, like the first time I introduced Andreas to it, I limited his exposure to 5 minutes. But I think you hung out there for longer. But 5 to 10 minutes would be a good amount initially. And I brought the Dream Machine, even though the Walter strobe is actually much more portable. It's about this big, and I can just kind of carry it in, it's lighter than like, I guess a briefcase. But the Walter strobe is extremely intense, whereas the Dream Machine is very gentle. It's got a warm incandescent light. You sort of feel like you're in the past, obviously the light bulb for one. And then also it has a very warm glow, kind of like when you close your eyes and look at the sun, that kind of light. And yeah, and then just let go. Don't expect anything. Just let go, and then you'll see these kind of images appear.
Is this on? This is a bit on the provocation of London's last slide. I'm fascinated by this idea that perhaps a new Turing test might involve art. that in some sense, art is invisible to AI. And I had an experience recently. I had taken a picture of a portrait gallery at the Brooklyn Museum, and I was looking at it on my phone, and it offered to remove all of the people in the picture. And I was like, okay. And it removed the people and the portraits. And it was this amazing sort of Walter Benjamin moment, you know, portraiture, photography, AI, like all sort of collapsing into this hallucination, if you will. But it's an interesting, you know, question. What does art mean? I guess that's why we're here with AI.
Yeah, for years, a big challenge with my father's artwork is actually being able to film it or even just take still pictures of it. And my father always complained about this and how difficult it was, and that there was never any good footage of his work. And so now, and I too kind of tried my best to capture his work, but now I actually think that this is really not a problem. This is actually what makes his work so great. It's because it's only capable of being experienced if you're a human being, and you have to be there. You know, you have to be in a body, have, you know, a brain and the eyes that we have to really see it.
Any other?
So while you were speaking, I was looking at this painting behind you, way behind you through the screen is a Frank Stella painting, which made me think about your early works of art, as his early works of art were very minimal. He was conceptual minimalist, and he was studying lines and geometric forms and things like that. And then as his career progressed, he goes into this madness, which he called maximalism, minimalism to maximalism. And it kind of made me think, and this was somewhat similar to and reminiscent of your photographs of your sculptures going crazy, right? So, you know, I'm trying to figure out, like, what is this propensity? What are the artists trying to find within this exploration and this movement towards this kind of wonderful visual madness? And it almost seems that, like, in advance of the knee-jerk propensity to calibrate meaning and order in things comes the flash of pure experience, which is very, you know, which is something that the artist or the athlete or the musician or the dancer or the, you know, tries to experience. In other words, let go of things. So my comment really has to do with the fact that maybe this kind of thing is perhaps a reflection of what we want to do, like, you know, the 19th century of understanding the world, perfect order, allows us to get to a point where what we were trying to understand is the lack of order, the chaos, the, you know, the berserk nature of things that we actually don't understand and perhaps can never understand, but which we can experience. I don't know if that made any sense.
It is. It's interesting that you picked the Frank Stella work, because there is a story when my dad had those exhibitions at the Amo Gallery in '64 and '65. An artist came in and wanted to know all about how my dad got his pigments, how he mixed them, and, you know, how he applied them and all that. And that artist was Frank Stella. And after that, he started making paintings with those pigments, and never credited my father, of course. But so this movement towards chaos is very interesting, because although many people don't know about this because he never exhibited these works, my father actually, in the last 10 years of his life, started creating these very chaotic cybernetic sculptures. They were like, they worked on the principles of his vibrating stainless steel rods, but they were like crazy and all over the place. And so in the catalog of his works, I call it his late works. And they exhibit sort of the freedom that he didn't allow himself, in his early career, mid-career even. And I think my artwork, my extension of cybernetics is that instead of moving, instead of reverting back to a stable homeostatic state, my works actually achieve homeostasis through intense viewer participation. And so otherwise it just reverts to kind of a chaotic state. So I think it's because of the generational difference in our perspective as to, promises of technology. And yeah.
We have time for one more question. So anyone?
So my question's about sort of in relation to our tendency to anthropomorphize AI systems and robotics. And so I'm wondering, from the historical perspective, have you encountered any information about how a kind of psychological space in relationship to these artworks or systems or processes, which tend to be devoid of sort of biological entities other than human interaction? So I'm curious about the kind of space of our psychology in relationship to it, both AI and sort of with these precedents from history. And then London, I'm curious about your relationship to math now, and having taken a different trajectory, pivoting towards art. If you feel like there are ideas or spaces that you've no longer have access to because you didn't continue to pursue math in a particular way. And so I'm wondering if you think about that at all in relationship to what you're producing and how you're producing it.
Well, I think all of you, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely. Yeah, there is certainly a tendency to anthropomorphize. It comes out, in this modern tendency to refer to the bugs in AI systems as hallucinations. It was pointed out to me recently that there is a difference between the way in which hallucination is used in reference to this bugginess of AI systems and the way it's used in relationship to human beings. Because in humans, it refers to perceptual illusions, right? Whereas in AI systems, it's just false information or wrong results. So there is very much a limit to the way in which that analogy can be used between machine systems. But to go back, I think, to the maybe the original part of your question, I mean, yes, it's hard to detect traces of biology or humanity in these systems, and yet, the systems very much, I think, reflect an original underlying analogy that is at the heart of cybernetics between machines and the human nervous system and the human brain. It's, they all derive from this basic, the discovery of the brain machine interface. And so although, yes, that kind of disappears in some of the works itself, if you make the effort, you can sort of read that original insight or analogy back into them. And in some cases, it's harder to do. In other cases, less difficult. I mean,
just to kind of pick up on that a little bit, one thing that this question really makes me think about is the distinction that one of the distinctions I try to make in the book is between posthumanism and the posthuman. I'm using the posthuman as a kind of historical moment we find ourselves in which the effects of cybernetics, what Andreas just described, the kind of underlying analogy between humans and machines, if you look at sort of, and animals for that matter, sort of intricate feedback networks, right? Posthumanism as being the sort of philosophical result of that, in which we can talk about these entities, humans, machines, and animals, on, in a certain sense, equal footing, right? So something like anthropomorphizing is almost redundant, like we're already anthropomorphized through that logic. What I'm trying to say is that posthumanism is refers to a moment in which we've sort of taken those leveling assertions and ideas as a given, right? Because we end up treating machines and animals almost the same way as our fellow humans.
Yeah, I would just add quickly that I think we have a tendency to see the humanness in every object we interact with in a way. You know, if I have a wooden spoon with a face on it, I see it as an entity in a way, which I do at home. I can talk to it. And also it's a tool for the artist, both as a PR thing, you know, quite honestly, to say like there's this thing, but also just as a tool to explain what you're doing to people, instead of saying like, oh, I have this algorithm and it divides this into 16 parts and they each stochastically do X, Y, Z. It's much easier to say, oh, there are 16 bots who are my band and I tell them all to play, and here I give them like some instructions and they improvise for me. It just sort of communicatively is really effective as well, I think.
London, do you want to?
Yeah, to address the question about how I feel about mathematics now that I'm no longer actively, I guess, working in it. You know, it's sort of like, well, John here is a mathematician. I sort of always wanted, when I really experienced mathematics, I really wanted to be a mathematician. And it was a privilege to glimpse these universes that are so different from ours. And I just didn't really have, I think, the kind of ability to go really far into it. And I think when I work in art and make my sculptures, they're kind of like attempts to find different worlds. And the miracle of this dream machine is that it actually opens up these portals in you, and it's not mathematics. It doesn't have the beauty of the structure in the sense pure math has, but it does have some sort of mystery and unexpectedness about it that I think the best math also has.
Can I just add one thing to London's earlier remark about the difference between your approach or your father's turn to sort of more chaotic ensembles and your own approach? I mean, I think, you know, one of the observations that Norbert Wiener made quite early on was that all systems, whether organic or inorganic, have a tendency towards crisis, where their original homeostatic state is disturbed. And, you know, and then they have to like figure out a way to try to overcome that crisis and return to that homeostatic state. And that's what's going on, I think, in your father's original sculpture. So there's some sort of disruption occurs, noise is introduced into a system, disruption occurs, and then the system restabilizes. But I think it's also, you know, it's also possible to elaborate on that I mean, I think this is one of the points that Wiener made, which is that systems can reorganize at a higher level, you know, so the crisis can actually be, you know, not something simply to be recovered from, but it can be productive in a kind of way. And I think that's, you know, kind of what's interesting about your maybe your father's later work, which I don't know so well, but your own work, which is that it, you know, it does not seek to return to some sort of original state of perfect calm or homeostasis, but to sort of try to find newer, higher levels of order in what appears to be disorder.
On that note, we'll end. And so make sure to go, if you're interested, the Dream Machine, room 9205. If you forget the room number, it's printed out on the desk between 12:30 and 1:30. If we have more times, we'll announce it. But thank you, gentlemen, for that wonderful conversation.